Well, let me welcome you all here to our talk this afternoon as part of the Philosophy Colloquium series. For those of you fortunate enough not to know me, I'm Ken Stikkers of the Philosophy Department, Associate Faculty of Africana Studies, and I'm very delighted to introduce somebody who I have to say, I mean, it's been perhaps the highlight of my time here at SIU is the opportunity that I had to work with Dr. Tommy Curry. Tommy Curry came to SIU originally as an undergraduate student recruited by the debate team. He was a national champion debater in high school and was recruited by our debate team. And I can't remember the exact year, but I remember you wandering into my office and shortly after you arrived, and went on from there. I saw him through his undergraduate times. I directed him. I guess it ended up misdirecting you to your first graduate study at DePaul University, where it was beginning a new program in Africana philosophy. And he decided, had the good wisdom to decide perhaps to return here for his doctoral studies that would have been in 2004, I believe. He completed his dissertation here in 2009, and I'm very proud to say under my direction. Was our regular meetings. I always felt that I always looked forward to you coming by my office because I knew I'd learned something that day. One of those students who I knew every time he knocked on my door that today was going to day, I was really going to learn something. That was always the case. We had the opportunity to teach a couple of courses, history of African American philosophy and philosophy of race. And Dr. Curry now is now associate professor at Texas A&M University. He just received this promotion after really only 3 years, which is quite remarkable to receive tenure and promotion after 3 years. Distinguished list of publications, I count 35 at least, published articles and published chapters. Again, just in a 4-year period. His work is in, of course, Africana philosophy, philosophy of race. And if I could just sort of generalize what I see as really, I think, the revolutionary effect that he's having on the whole field of Africana philosophy is in revealing how the gatekeeping that goes on in the profession is still very much a white-dominated sort of gatekeeping. I think the work that he's done in challenging really what counts as legitimate philosophy in generally, especially within the Africana philosophy. What I think his work has done is to reveal how so much of what has gone on as Africana philosophy has been determined by what is acceptable to a very distinctly white academy, and therefore how one of the deep structures of racism that is still very much prevalent in the philosophical profession is that what gets counted as philosophy generally, but specifically what is legitimate Africana philosophy, it gets determined largely by white interests. And so this is what I see as really the revolutionary effect that he is having on the profession. He's become widely recognized in a very short period as I would say the leading, younger scholar in Africana philosophy in the country. He recently, for example, assumed the role as the director of the Philosophy Born of Struggle project, which is in its 20th year. He's become the new director of that. And I think that the people made very, very good judgment in passing on the torch. That is, this is I think the major forum for the study and advancement of Africana philosophy in the United States. And so I think it's well in very good hands. So anyway, it's a great delight to see Dr. Tommy Curry return to our campus. And he tells me now that he is given a new title to his talk here, and so it is now Eschatological Dilemmas, Racism, Death, and the Anti-Ethical Life-Death of the Nigger. And so I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Tommy Curry.
I have always have to thank Ken, Dr. Smoot, Dr. Brown. These were the intellectual hubs when I was here at SIUC. So, contrary to popular belief, I wasn't that popular when I was here.
I know both.
Yeah, exactly. You know, I used to write for the Daily Egyptian. You know, I got pictures of burning crosses and people in white hats. You know, what's up, Doug? So you know, it's coming back here. It's really interesting. You know, I really appreciate Ken's comments because I think that when you look at the field of Africana philosophy and the elder scholars that came before me, they did what they had to do to get through. And no one could take anything away from that. I think the real question, however, though, becomes how do we institutionalize and make a rigorous understanding of studying African descended people in Africana philosophy, given what we know the overarching repressive systems of white supremacy are in the field. All right. So the paper I'm giving today is Eschatological Dilemmas, Racism, Death, and the Anti-Ethical Life, Death of the Nigger. I want to start off with something. I want to give two very brief stories. I think when we talk about racism, sometimes we miss what racism actually is. So Orlando Patterson, for instance, argues that black people live a type of social death, a death where people don't have a heritage, where they're not connected by blood ties. They're kind of like zombies, right? That we walk around the world that's, you know, unfiltered, no joy, etc. I don't really agree with that view, but I want to give you a very short story. I came through philosophy here, and while I was a student, finished my coursework in a year. Took a little longer to write the dissertation because I needed the money. After I got the money, went to Penn State, did a postdoc. Okay, I recently found out through names that I won't mention that when they called, they were looking for black philosophers. They had a job at Texas A&M. Called back here, asked, well, who do you have? Who's somebody that can study and do these issues? And one of the responses that they got was, well, you don't want Tommy because he's a troublemaker. You're going to have a problem with him. Now, some people would say, well, you know, that's just a personal anecdote, etc. But I ask you to consider this. Let's say that a black person gets a PhD in philosophy and they're unemployable. And they're a black man in this country. What kind of life does that determine for the black man? He has a PhD that's practically useless outside of that field. He's in a discipline in a university and an apparatus that sees no value whatsoever to the study of black men or black people specifically. And then you ask yourself, what kind of life does that create for him? A life of poverty? A life of lecturing? A life where he can't sustain himself or his family if he's married, or his partner if he's not? Right? What kind of social existence is predicated on racism that not only depends on individuals? See, this is the important part you have to understand. It doesn't depend on the racism of the individual that said that you don't want Tommy Curry. It depends on the enforcement of the racism of the society, that the individual can make the argument and know that the consequences of his racism or her racism will be carried out by a white supremacist society, right? So their individual prejudice is carried out and enforced in a way because they know what the prejudice and the power structures are in the world. The second brief story I want to give you is one that just simply demonstrates the danger of being a black man in this country. Think about Jonathan Farrell, a man who was completely debilitated because of a car wreck, sought help, and the fear of a white woman enforced the state to kill him, right? Now, these are two aspects of death, social death and physical death. And these are the two poles of what I'm going to be talking about today, right? The existence that white people take away from you because individual prejudice, their aspirations for anti-blackness is carried out by white supremacist society, and then the simple physical death of black people, specifically black men, that's taken up as a cause and a deterrent for black political organization. So 3 are epigraphs. I want to start with Abdul John Muhammad, Negating Negation, 1987. Muhammad says, the most crucial aspect of resisting the hegemony consists in struggling against his attempt to form one's subjectivity. For it is through the construction of the minority subject that the dominant culture can elicit the individual's own help in his or her oppression. One of the most powerful weapons in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Without control of the latter's mind, the dominant culture can enforce compliance only through the constant use of brute force. The second epigraph I want to read is from Greg Thomas. Thomas argues the histories of gender and slavery focus overwhelmingly on women, as if gender and women are coextensive and men have no gender. This observation points to a problem with the conceptualization of sex and gender across academic disciplines. For if there is a structural neglect of manhood in studies of gender, and if womanhood is misunderstood to be synonymous with gender itself, then this approach signifies an extension rather than an analysis of gender ideology, which traditionally ascribes woman as being gendered and men as being generic and beyond gender. And the last quote comes from Elaine Brown, The Condemnation of Little B in 2003, where she says, the case against Little B, that was his nickname, his real name is Michael Lewis, was really about accommodating a powerful, racist, political, social, economic agenda that had once invented and condemned black boys as super predators. So I say this all to say that there is an eeriness that haunts the grammar of philosophical discourse on racism that predicates ethical problems and moral dispositions on death. White society's necromancy and black people's necrophobia. The historical event of slavery is maintained to be continuous with the social death in works like Frank Wilderson's Red, White, and Black, Cinema and the Structure of U.S. Antagonisms from 2010, or Saida Hartman's Scenes of Subjugation, Terror, Slavery, and Self-Making in 19th Century America, which was written in 1997. Text borrowing from Orlando Patterson's concept of natal alienation, right? So this is the concept of social death I was talking about in Slavery and Social Death in 82, which points out the ontological exsanguination of the enslaved. Exsanguination is the bleeding out, right? Of the enslaved and the striving for life in Abdul Muhammad's elucidation of writing and death and negating the negation as a form of affirmation of minority discourse in 1987. As oppositional poles of enslavement and the humanity demonstrated in black existence or persistence. Today, however, writing, textual speech, academic talk sustains a discourse of black death as a catalyst for and motivation behind sustained engagements with disciplines and the white oppressor class under the imagery of the slave, but the imperial sentimentality of the black intellectual described in E. Franklin Frazier's The Failure of the Black Intellectual, whereby the process of black intellectualization is a deniggerization, or as Woodson or Frazier says, emptying of his or her life of meaningful and content and ridding him of all Negro identification. This process, right? This process where we write about black people but see ourselves as fundamentally distinct from the black people that we write about, right? It's reflected into this kind of academic bourgeoisie. This is what Woodson talks about in Miseducation of Negro, where this academic Negro is content to confine the study of black folk to categories that simultaneously reflect the anthropological histories and post-racial possibilities of white humanity and the pathological representation of the nigger, i.e. the people we study, right? And I want to be very clear about something right here. This is the philosophical problem, right? This is the academic bourgeois problem. This was the problem that black studies as a discipline sought to write out of the practice of how we interpret black people, right? So when Sylvia Winters, and I'm going to quote her in a second, when Sylvia Winters is making the argument about the fundamental organic chemistry of black studies in the endemic study of black people studying themselves, needing new concepts for humanity, that's what she's talking about. Because she understood that black nationalism and the black arts movement, the aesthetics of living black existence, was the foundation not of performance, but of conceptualization of black humanity. What we have done is forgotten that. So in the process of doing academic writing, we have encapsulated concepts of blackness in language, terminologies, and disciplines that are alien to ourselves. And this is what I mean when I talk about the process of deniggerization. In being the academic bourgeoisie and writing about black people, we have distanced ourselves running from death. This is necrophobia, running from death so that we can write about the people we observe, but we don't want to be those black folk, right? Right? So the role of the canonical knowledge is then the means by which life is grasped away from the wretchedness sown into the flesh of black people and the death of niggers. It's my position that we write and assimilate blackness into the colonial categories of disciplines to escape actual physical death and distance ourselves from the social death through class and social mobility in America. And that black men and boys, the conditions that legitimate their death, supersedes the disciplinary apparatus used to account for black men and black boys actually dying. Now notice the move I'm making here. I'm not talking about Patterson's social death. I don't care about a whole bunch of bourgeois people that don't feel they're connected to other people. I care about actual death. I care about the people that can't speak anymore because they're no longer here to do it. And this is kind of the this is the ontology that I'm actually interested in. Not the ontology of representation, where we talk about the ontology of dead bodies as the basis for conversation, but actual people dying. As a black man, I'm curious about that process. What does it mean when I'm still here to speak, but pretty soon could be killed at any moment so that I can't speak? What is the academic, the philosophical content of dealing with death? That's why it's an eschatological dilemma. Because once you're dead, you can't say a damn thing anymore. Now you can only be interpreted. So you take a group of people, a subgroup of black people, black men who you know are being murdered, incarcerated at record levels. And you create an academic discipline that is interested in incarceration, but they can't speak for themselves. Because now we let black feminism speak for them. Now we let Marxism speak for them. Now we let phenomenology speak for them. Because we know that these categories can encapsulate them because they can't do it for themselves, right? What kind of bourgeois category and class does that create? So blackness is running out of the academic enterprise generally. It's forcing conceptual expressions of convergence and canonical imitation, right? So those of you who have read my article on derelict method or the derelict crisis of African American philosophy know what I mean when I talk about epistemic convergence. While black maleness is altogether ignored and erased specifically, thought of only as pathological and the platform from which other gender discourses form in reaction towards. In spite of the world before us, where young black boys, children, are murdered by the state and other white vigilantes for their potentiality and propensity to become black men, academic writing, the research that it aims to convey, remains categorically indifferent to the contradictions that melanin holds in a white supremacist state that not only denies masculinity to black men and boys, but imposes patriarchy upon them as concretely unfettered and accepted violence wielded not only by white men and white women, but rationally enforced by the state. For these studies, the writing about is not enough. The erasure of the black male from philosophical and conceptual study is not the result of a failure to attend to, but rather the deliberate attention to the need to displace or eliminate the realities of black men's deaths and the violence against black boys, our children, to enforce a division between disciplinary knowledge and the problem people observe. Right? So my thesis is going to explore this from two different aspects. Winter's No Humans Evolved and the problem of genre when the nigger is writing about, but their deaths are avoided. Over 2 decades ago, in an article entitled No Humans Evolved, Sylvia Winter exposed the complacency of the academic enterprise in the social reification rather than the refutation of the onto-anthropological nomenclature of Western biologism taken to be man, and the violence this exclusionary anthropology has on the black man in America. Winters uses the Rodney King verdict as her case study. The force of Winter's analysis surrounding the violence against Rodney King is not simply the infusion of social or non-ideal context, or horror into the vacuous and sterile albatross of knowledge, or an attempt to remind us to think more critically about what we claim to know or what we define we claim to possess in knowing or as knowledge. Rather, Winters demands that we reject the biologized humanity we claim has the faculty of knowing, and the concomitant apotheosis of disciplinary conceptual theoretical knowledge that valorizes Western man as the revelatory vessel of colonial history to the exclusion of black people, the non-humans. The non-human, the no human, the man not, does not refer to a slurring of black men that can be thought of as speaking badly of poor young black men. It is not a stereotype in the sense that it can be rationally engaged. Rather, to speak of black men's engagement with the LAPD in the case of Rodney King, or the police state more generally, is to articulate the meaning black maleness has in the grammar of racism. It is discursive logics that legitimately and subtly precede violence. For Winters, this term is held into focus by the dehumanizing intent of police engagement with black men, since, quote, these young men had to first be classified and thereby treated differently from all other North Americans, end quote. So you see what Winters is trying to get at here, right? Winters is trying to talk about how black men are classified as non-humans. And I find this extremely interesting in her work, because Winters is not simply making an appeal to identity politics. Right? I'm always saying when I read this paper, when I'm researching this and trying to explain to other scholars, this is not an issue of substitution. Right? We're not trying to put black men into the category of gender. Rather, what you're trying to show is how the conditions and experience and existence of black men in and of itself fractures the concept of gender itself. Why it's unuseful outside of a Western disciplinary ontology that gives certain kinds of biological precedent to femininity and womanhood as the basis of subjugation and oppression that can't conceive of black maleness, the existence of black men in a white supremacist society, as being anything other but generic violence. Right? And we'll get to white women raping black men in a second, so I know y'all enjoy that. Right? So rejecting such ontology is not simply the work of discussions over and against writings about the degraded anthropos of modernity. This is not a dialogical resolution of death symbolically where dead black bodies become textualized and recast in academic literature. Black death is the silencing of, the extinguishing of lies that demonstrate the contradiction of anti-blackness within empire, or whether the white supremacist republic parading the mask of democracy that displays the death of black men and boys for social order and political subservience. For black men specifically, the denial of their humanity, of being human, while being epidermalized as a nigger, is catalytic. It brings with it the basis for black death, while remaining seemingly invisible in the various facets of black social life. Here, the black academic points to political progress, mutual dialogue, and class mobility, meaning economic difference from black death, as justification for their racial diagnosis. In this view, black death, physical death, murder, is external to and not endemic of the normative, civilized, educated black existence. Winter urges the reader to consider the relationship between the paradigms of dehumanization that resulted in the genocide of Armenians by Turkish pan-nationalists, the Holocaust inflicted upon Jews by Germans, and the language used to describe through taxonomy black men as a species deserving death. To classify the deaths of black men as no humans involved is to reify the sociogenic principle behind anti-blackness, or as Winter says, quotes, for the social effects of this acronym NHI, while not overtly genocidal, are clearly serving to achieve parallel ends: the incarceration and elimination of young black males by ostensibly normal and everyday means, end quote. So Winter's analysis of anti-black death makes the black male the conceptual paradigm of inquiry, the lens through which this kind of death is best viewed, in the body that should be grasped by the imagination to fully comprehend the ontology and consequence of the violence that perpetuates this anti-black horror. Destroying the black male body, murdering the black life that demanded to be more than the petrified phantasm of the white imagination. Notice Caesar here, right? The thingification. We get the same kind of impetus in Huey P. Newton's classification of black men, the poor black man. Extinguishes the idea of the black human that the white supremacist world demands cannot exist. Killing black men who dare to speak against and live beyond their place erases them from the world, making an example and leaving only their dead, melanated corpse as a deterrent against future revolts against white knowledge, right? And this is something that people just don't talk about. I see all kind of feminist blogs, all kind of Huffington Posts, all kind of Salon articles that talk about black men dying. But what's the political effect of black men dying? What does it show us? The same thing that King shows us. The same thing that X shows us. That you talk too much, the state will kill you. But despite us playing these identity politics games, right? Trayvon Martin was killed, but suddenly I feel bad because we're not having marches for, Ayanna Stanley, right? Instead of asking how the state keeps killing black people and little black girls, asking why that does not become the basis of our conceptual political representations, i.e. black feminism, who will not question the state, black feminism which will not talk about how white women, these partners in solidarity, have been raping and killing black men, right? Empire. The notion that gender and class can somehow be manipulated in certain specific types of knowledge that don't serve the end of black people. This is not the agenda that we get on Huffington Post. We get great interviews. But this is not the agenda that we see coming out of the political or public intellectual realm. We don't see Skip Gates talking about this. He rather convinces that black people sold black people into slavery, so it's not really about race, right? These are distractions because the ability of us to talk about race in the first place is fundamentally predicated, right? Depends on the ability of us to see black people die. We see Oscar Grant shot, assassinated, executed, and they put it up on YouTube. But we're supposed to pretend that this has absolutely no deterrent effect on the political and psychological embodiments of blackness, specifically a radical type of blackness. As if this has no effect on the types of works that black academics are going to produce. Right? We show death. We show that you should avoid death. We create a class means to do so and let you talk about the people that are dying. And what do? You run away from it so that you don't get associated with those types of black folk, right? So Winters reformulates our popular understanding of how we explain discourse as cultural, right? So this is what I'm talking about, right? That there's a cultural and a political manifestation to what we write, how we write, and what we say. This reformulation is not critical in the traditional sense from which discourse, language, or knowledge is legitimated or semiotically relevant in specific social, cultural, historical contexts, but that language is cultural in that discourse bursts, gives legitimacy to institutions, and symbiotically regenerates social cultural environments, reconfirming the problem of white knowledge internalized by the learned Negro in Woods' miseducation. And it highlights the dangers of asserting power, recognition, knowledge as man in the matrix of white supremacy. And beyond categories of the master's conception in 1992, this is an article that was written the same year as No Human Evolved. Winters argues, to be effective, systems of power must be discursively legitimated. This is not to say that power is originally a set of institutional structures that are subsequently legitimated. On the contrary, it is to suggest the equiprimordiality of structure and cultural conceptions in the genesis of power. These cultural conceptions, encoded in language and other signifying systems, shape the development of political structure and are also shaped by them. The cultural aspects of power are as original as the structural aspects. Each serves as a code for the other's development. It is from these elementary cultural concepts that complex legitimating discourses are constructed. End quote. Now, the black academic bourgeois learns to use these categories to save us from death. Categories that allow us to cling to life, recognition, solidarity with the worker, the woman, or the progressive, that breathes life into the thingified sociogenic product of anti-black racism that is anthropologically participating and by consequence beyond or seen as more than the innate inanimate properties of the black thing. Right? So we know that racism, right? This is Fanon, this is Césaire. You could even read Wright in this way, right? This thingification, right, of how we think about black people. And in order to gain humanity, what do? Right? And this is Muhammad's point. We write ourselves into humanity. We're severed with our heritage, we're severed with our blood, so we use writing as our lifeline to heritage and history, right? Now, theoretically, I have no problem with that. I think the slave narrative shows us ample evidence that this is a legitimate means to reclaim and resist. However, academicization, professionalization, disciplinarity turns this into a very pathological practice, very pathological practice. So later in No Human Evolved, Winter concretizes what this relationship between discursive legitimacy and power means for the unhumanized and what she calls, quote, the historical racial schema that predefines his body as an impurity to be cured, a lack, a defect, to be amended into the true being of whiteness, end quote. Our conceptual schema as being American is in fact distancing from the jobless black man who is targeted for death. Winters argues that it is this category of the jobless young black males who have been made to pay the sacrificial costs for the relatively improved conditions since the 1960s that have impelled many black Americans out of the ghettos and into the suburbs, that made possible the universal acclamation for the Cosby-Huxtable TV family, who proved that some black Americans could aspire to and even be drawn inside the sanctified category of Americanness in its perfect form, end quote. Now this is so important. This is so important because what Winters is pointing to is the division, right? These collateral costs of the civil rights movement. So, you think all those black nationalists just went away, right? They had a change of heart, right? The state killed them, and the poor people who were revolutionized and radicalized by them had to go into silence. They were erased from the political spectrum of America. You marginalize them so they can't participate. You marginalize them so they can't educate, right? And who do you move in? You move in Skip Gates. You move in bourgeois people, Beverly Guy Patel, people who are going to further and perpetuate fights and pathologies between other black people that attack the machinations of white supremacy, state, and empire, right? Bring in Bell Hooks. Let her argue with black men all day. Make her write books about cultural criticism that have absolutely no historical basis whatsoever, because she just made them up, and no citations, by the way, right? And let her talk about why she should form solidarity with white women, and the whole time the black men have only thought about their penises. They're just phallocentric, right? They're driven by the power of the black dick, and they really just want white women, right? But these become the types of spectacles that we entertain in scholarship. So we have an analysis where people like Huey P. Newton gives us an argument about the progressive nature of black men. That we have to look at women's liberation. We have to look at what we now call queer theory or queer identity, right? And we have to understand that we need those people, much like Cheryl Clark's article about transforming the black community in 1983, that we need these people because to be a black community empowered is not to reproduce the hierarchical structures of man-woman that we find in European communities. The same issue with genre that Sylvia Wynter argued about in The Map is the Territory, saying that we cannot reproduce biologism that we get out of Western anthropology is the basis for how black people have performed all aspects of sexuality simultaneously in motherhood, dance, cultural reifications, and their own conceptualization. This is the African mother idea and the damnation of the woman by Du Bois. But we ignore this, right? Because these things don't fit into the categorical conceptualizations of how disciplines allow us to express blackness. So this ascendancy of a specific class of black Americans, those black Americans aspiring to be seen as different from those not humans, niggers, man-nots, has been the neglect of black men and boys dying. And the necrophobia rewarded by the necromancy of the white supremacist institutions. Police, state, government, CIA, COINTELPRO, you get the idea. There's a problem that emerges in how we assign, describe, and evaluate the conditions of black people. We constrain them into categories suitable for analysis, but continue to ignore the limitations and moralities that are privileged in the study under these sorts of conditions, right? Now, I'm going to give a very brief synopsis here, because I think that this book is really important, Elaine Brown's Condemnation of Little B. And in this book, what Elaine Brown tries to argue is that there's a new type of racism, right? A type of racism that she really credits Newton for understanding decades before we got here. And what that type of racism is the new Uncle Toms and new Miss Anns. That because we can't understand that racism functions along axes of political economy, right? So we have these mythologies, right? We think that every black person during slavery, every black person was a revolutionary. They were all in that term, right? No black person really sold black people out because we believe in blackness. This rich, thick concept, right? Every black woman was raped. She went to her grave dying, trying not to be raped by masters, right? Nice ideological tropes, but not true, right? Black people did tell on black people. Why? Because the relative privilege of property, the relative privilege of less work, the lesser degree of suffering, provided an incentive for them to go with the status quo. Rape was always a crime, not saying that. There are some people who understood that being raped was better than being lynched, right? See, the dynamics and political economics of suffering create different incentives for you to go along with certain degrees of blackness. But we've lost that. And what Elaine Brown suggests to us is that we understand the totality of blackness, and we have to also understand the concept of the bourgeois. That there are some black capitalists who profit off the death of other black people. And this was the case of Little B. That it's easy to blame black men, young black boys, as a pathology, as a disease that has to be cured. It funds the prison industrial complex. It can motivate, as in the case of her story, it can motivate certain people into political office. It can justify the increase in militarization of the police state. These are all things that have become very easily fitted onto the bodies and the imagination, or the imaginations of how we think about black men in this country. Why? Because we view black men as dangerous. And I always find this ironic. I was having an argument with Greg Thomas over Gmail the other day. You know, and we were discussing this project, and he was saying, well, look, you know, I think part of it's identity politics. I think you advocate for black men too much. And I asked him, I was like, well, look, I'm confused about something. Name me some other social creature or political subject that can both be conceptualized as the rapist, right, the myth of the black rapist, and simultaneously be told that he is only trying to fulfill in his masculinity homoerotic desires on the down low. And that his sexual appetite in both cases is either criminalized or pathological, because either way, he's either destroying black women or killing black women through AIDS. What other political subject can be both heterosexual and homosexual, both as a function of pathology, criminal or neurosis? I can't think of one. But somehow this kind of unique political ontology doesn't interest most people, right? We don't, because, and I argue, because we don't understand black men in sexualized terms. They have no gender, they're generic, right? They're generic, they're just there, they're the thing. They're just a thing, right? So how then do we deal with this sexual aspect that Elaine Brown argues about? And I argue that we should do it from Thomas Foster's perspective. He writes a very interesting article called "The Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under Slavery." So the section title of this is "The Sexual Abuse of Black Men and the Sexual Vulnerability of Black Men to White Womanhood, the Social Ontology of Race by the Gender Category." On September 16, 2013, the white state replied to a 911 call of a white woman fearful of a black man asking for help at her doorstep after surviving a car accident. Her fear of the black man caused his assassination. He is or was known as Jonathan Ferrell. Black male death, as evidenced in Ferrell, Oscar Grant, Trayvon Martin, 5 white women in Trayvon Martin, just got to point that out, is seen as generic, a general operation of racism. Now, Saida Hartman's scene of subjugation wants to argue that brutality, the libidinal economy of slavery, and when she uses the word libidinal, she gets this from Wilderson and Sexton. What she means is you have not only a political economy in terms of how different things are valued and culturally based or materialistically based, but you also have an economy of desires. You will or desire things to be. So when you think of rape, it's a desire about the capacity of the body to please you. When you think about servants or submission. It's the desire for that body to actually subserve and become that thing that you can use in that way, right? So there's a formation of the material before you get to the material itself in political economics, right? And it says the libidinal economy of slavery is at its apex or most extreme degree upon the female slave body because of rape. That's your contention. Jared Saxton's reply to Madimbe's Necropolitics in 2003, and Giorgio Agamben's Homo Saucier Tetralogy, which makes the refugee subject under neoliberal contention in people of color blindness, notes on the aftermath of slavery, again centers the subject of oppression, of the crisis of national sovereignty, of state violence, as the black female slave against other subjectivization created by the crisis of sovereignty. While Hartman gives a rich analysis of suffering, pain, and dehumanization being necessary to and thriving as the condition of enslavement, she too reifies the idea that rape and sexual assault is a province of enslaved womanhood. She says, quote, gender, if at all appropriate in this scenario, must be understood as indissociable from violence. The vicious refiguration of rape as mutual and shared desire, the wanton exploitation of the captive body, tacitly sanctioned as a legitimate use of property, the disavowal of injury, and the absolute possession of the body and its issue. In short, black and female difference is registered by the virtue of the extremity of power operating on captive bodies and licensed within the scope of the humane and the tolerable. Now, Hartman's point is insightful in that it links pain and violence to the definition of enslaved bodies, but her analysis is categorically misleading, since there is no reason to make her conceptualization of rape as desire and exploitation a privation isolated to the enslaved female body. Thomas's 2007 analysis of essentializing femininity's vulnerabilities as the concept of gender itself is both instructive in exposing the undisclosed meaning of gender. Remember, this goes back to Greg Thomas's epigraph I read at the beginning of the essay, and a corrective, since Thomas dismisses the idea that only women are victimized by rape, which is a key insight that's needed when we evaluate Hartman's contention. Thomas argues, for instance, it is almost impossible to locate a text of slavery which does not construe rape as the bottom line factor that differentiates the spirit of slavery along lines of sex or gender. Allegedly, the female can be violated and the male cannot. This assumption is unacceptable, if not absurd, because it perversely requires heterosexuality to recognize exploitation and abuse. Not only is sexual violence reduced to whatever qualifies as rape, narrowly construed, but rape is also limited to penile penetrations of female bodies, perhaps not even those unless they result in pregnancy and offspring, end quote. Now, Thomas Foster's Sexual Abuse of Black Men Under American Slavery in 2011 argues that the sexual assault of enslaved black men was a component of slavery and took place in a wide variety of contexts in wide range of forms. In addition to the direct physical violence or abuse of men that happened under slavery, this sexual exploitation constituted a type of psychological abuse that was ubiquitous, end quote. Right? Now, the feminist left, under the guise of progressive reform and discipline, uses sanction, shame, and silence to enforce kind of their ontological copyright on gender, on the concept of rape. Right? Now, why does this happen? Why does this happen? Both Thomas and Foster are arguing that the conceptualization of rape as being female specific not only silences the voices of black men trying to react against white women's racism, right, which seems to be legitimate, it's goddamn historical, right, it happened, right, but the other part about it, and this is the part that really pisses me off, is that it fails to allow any critical intervention into ways that concepts like feminism or progressivism or liberalism allegedly co-align itself and reinforce certain notions of white supremacist history revisionism. Because now we can make arguments about white womanhood that only reify the myth of the black rapist instead of looking at it within a dynamic context of black men having an actual historical argument and political motivation against womanhood itself and white women specifically. So in the case of Trayvon Martin, in the case of Jonathan Farrell, we have allowed feminism to speak for the types of tragedies that have involved black men because allegedly, conceptually, politically, white feminism, black feminism are the only mediums we have to talk about sexual violence, even though it happens to black men and boys, despite those people looking like me and other black men and boys who can't speak for them. So death is enforced through the categorical copyright and imposition of what counts as gender. So even when Elaine Brown has made the argument that we have the super predator, the myth of young black boys being a danger to everyone, including the black community, we have no language for it. and we are content to write those bodies, those existences, out of academic focus. Because we will rather classify them as gender and say, let the black feminists talk about the issue with white feminism. Now, what's the danger of this? The danger of this is that the reification of these types of practices fail to question the relationship that writing has with our political ontologies. The reality of the fact is that black male death, despite how far we run from it, still happens. And black male death is one of the facets of how we understand political dissent. Because every figure that we have, and it's not to say that black women have not been erased from history, but every figure that we have is an image of a black man burning, hanging from a tree, castrated. It is a symbol of the androgynous aspects of racism. It doesn't matter if that man is quote unquote straight or gay. The black dick is a problem because it perpetuates progeny. It brings about the ability of more people to fight in revolutions. So when you destroy the black male body, right, you destroy the symbol, especially the patriarchal culture. Think about this. In a patriarchal culture where white men believe they have power over God himself, what do you think it means to them to castrate a black man? What do you think it means when a white man raped a black boy? We don't have a concept of it because we've allowed heteronormativity and Western concepts of what man is to insert itself in how we read ourselves, despite the fact these are white inventions, despite the fact that we have the neuter concept from Amadou Men, despite the fact that Du Bois takes up this question of black men and children and their mortal child. We've let that go. Because now we only care about what categories are politically defined and which get us published. And these become our methodology. These become the methods, the concepts that we hold dear. Not the concepts that actually tell us about black existence. Not the concepts that actually testify how writing meshes up, parallels the consequences of the world, but rather how we benefit from it. Right? So what my paper is trying to demonstrate, I'm pretty sure you got this throughout my yelling, right? What my paper is trying to demonstrate then is how the process of academic and philosophical writing is rather a censure rather than an expression. That if we continue to write ourselves representationally into canons, and we continue to write ourselves conceptually into white disciplines, then we're not writing about ourselves at all. Because we're using death as a symbolic reference for what we should get. Those poor black folk died. Give me 10. Those poor black folk died. Right? Give me a promotion, hire me, because I can talk about those poor black folk. Black women in the hood, they have 20 babies. They don't know who their daddy is. Hire me in women's studies. Right? See, these types of transfigurations, right, of how we understand black suffering become currency for the black academic. Right? And by the way, this is antithetical to what black studies is supposed to do, by the way. Just want to throw that out there. Right? Right? So then we have to ask ourselves this question. If we know that knowledge systems formulate themselves on reification and reproduction, repetition, then when we reproduce that, when we become the vessels of this type of language, this type of textualization of black suffering, then we have to implicate ourselves in that type of dehumanization. Right? So the end of my project simply suggests, and I've argued this in terms of cultural logics, anti-ethics, etc., is that if we pay attention to the physicality, the materiality of black death, that it exposes the contradiction of the aspects of writing, most specifically writing surrounding the concept, the category of gender. And what I'm arguing for here is a confrontation of black death, not in terms of how we reference it, but in terms of how black death ruptures what we take to be black social life, i.e. the academic and bourgeois capitalist economic practices that allow us to live as being distant from the black folk that we make our living off of. All right? Thank you. Questions?
No, not a question. I didn't think I'd live this long to hear somebody else say it. But the notion of the castrated body on the tree is central
Absolutely.
because they kept it in a jar at home, which is also part of that narrative. But I just want to throw out another picture. Frederick Douglass
Mm-hmm.
Douglas is telling us your story,
Right.
and nobody wants to read that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm very happy to hear you reading that, because I can say, hallelujah.
No, that's an important point. That's an important point. But you have to understand, and I want to be very honest about this. The type of backlash that I've gotten for trying to introduce a different line of sexuality into the narrative of slavery, as well as how we conceptualize political subjects, and how it's outside of the political narratives of feminism, has been met with stark resistance.
Oh,
Stark resistance.
no.
Right. Yeah. You know, it speaks, you know, and it's disappointing because, you know, I was just telling Ken and some of the students up in philosophy that the project I'm working on now is really trying to show how feminism, at least in the second way, Gloria Steinem, Miss Magazine, Wallace, etc., have been funded by the CIA. Like, I'm trying to find the archival materials that show that relationship. I know there's a public announcement of it. I work for the CIA. Like, that's not a big deal. But I'm trying to actually, you know, substantiate with some textual, you know, findings, some archival findings, and that sentiment, the idea that there can be a use of a progressive left movement to break up black radicalism, specifically sanction the violence of the state against black men. You know, black feminists don't want to hear it at all. So it's both disappointing, but kind of expected in the sense that it really shows what Greg Thomas is talking about in terms of how categories work. You know, I mean, I thought white people were bad when I pissed on Royce, but evidently this is a little more egregious. You can call Royce a racist, but damn it, don't talk about Steinem. Other questions, comments, criticisms? Yes, sir.
I guess the tension that comes to my head is isolating the materiality of Black Death is something that should be focused on to kind of rub predominant social ideas of occurrence, but also kind of with the beginning framing, which is how do you speak about death when you were dead? And I guess what would be your suggestions for putting materiality as kind of the center of our paradigm focus, while also being sensitive to the method and the way in which Black Death is often written about people who have a privilege in writing it in a certain way.
Right,
and it's
right.
kind of the tension that I've been trying to deal with. How do you sort through that?
Well, I think the first thing is that we don't consider ourselves to be interpreters, right? We're storytellers. Okay. When we think about Black Death, and I want to be clear here, I'm not suggesting that all writing does this. I'm specifically talking about the genre of academic writing, because I think academic writing, alongside what Sylvia Winters is talking about, really does focus on recognition and assimilating the concepts of black selfhood, culture, etc., into Western anthropology, right? And I think that's very important. So in my work, I call this epistemic convergence, or the problem of racial normativity, under the global idea of derelict, okay? And what that means is that when we try to talk about black life, the way that we get conceptual, theoretical, or philosophical recognition, that we fold black life into white categories. So that's why Dewey becomes a pragmatist, or Du Bois becomes a pragmatist, or Hegelian, etc. We read them into these theoretical categories so they have cachet. So I think that if we are serious or rigorous about academic writing and compare it to some of these more organic literatures, so I mean, you know, use the slave narratives for instance. I like the Black Panther magazine back in the 1960s. That stuff just is too raw for you, you know. Like, really? Right, yeah. You know, I mean, those are the types of writings that really hit you because they're trying to come from a folk aspect of how black people are experiencing the world. In terms of our aesthetics, we have hip hop. Greg Thomas makes a beautiful argument in terms of how we should look at Little Kim's body representations. You know, I'm kind of in tension about that, but I get the thrust of the argument, right? The thrust of the argument is that aesthetics gives a testament to the existential phenomenologies that black people produce, not perform. And in the same way that we tell oral stories, the same way that black people are actually living, adjusting, make political decisions to try to skirt around death, the police state challenge it, etc. These are all stories worthy of theoretical investigation. And when I say theoretical investigation, I don't mean that we encapsulate them as something other than what they are to be theoretical. I think that's how we deal with that tension.
There
Right.
reminds me a lot of Incognito by Wilderson, which is
Yeah.
that's why it's so visceral.
Right,
It's
right. But
coming out.
Wilderness has got some problems.
Yeah.
You see, and you know, and I'm gonna go off on Wilderson for a second. I like the thrust of Wilderson's argument, but Wilderson wants to use Lacanian psychoanalysis as the basis of how we ground political subjects. So what does that mean? That means that we have a psychological effect and experience of how we internalize slaveocracy, right? right? That's why he wants to create kind of the political subject of the day as the slave. Really? Right? Enslavement happened. It's a historical incident. African descended people were some before they were enslaved. So if you're going to make the argument that slave is a political ontology within the Western system, sure. But I'm going to ask you, where are the cultural resources that you get from people like a Sylvia Wynter or Greg Thomas to talk about how black people have dealt with the political ontology of the slave? In other words, what about maroonage, right? What about the Black Panthers? What about the outlaw? What about the social deviant? What about the exile? What about Robert F. Williams? You see what I'm saying? The reaction that African descended people have had to the geopolitical incarceration of the self within slavery or enslavement has been always reacted to. So you can't give me a political ontology that goes all the way down without talking about a black existence which is trying to build itself up, right? So when I talk about anti-ethics, killing white people, I feel pretty secure in that argument. Why? Because it's a historical articulation of how black people have made sure that white people know that you're contingent too. You can be killed too. This is Ida B. Wells, and this is what Robert F. Williams says, right? Superior white people don't want to trade their lives for inferior black lives. So that shocks you, right? That puts some in their psychology. That's the form of resistance that I don't think Wilson can capture because he's worried about a psychoanalytic substantiation of the slave category rather than the resistance and other tools that African descended people have used to challenge it all the way through. So when you call a black person a slave, they say, no, I'm a human. I may not have your language, I may not have your word, but I'm not this, right? I'm not this property, right? This is Douglas. You don't make laws for dogs to say that they're not human because you know they're not human. But you have to make laws to tell me that I can't read, that I can't organize, that I can't pray, right? This is the PISA system that you get out of Winters because they knew they weren't property. So then I want to know, well, then why is your ontology trying to create laws and social organization enforcing me something that you know that I'm not either? That's the dishonesty of the white mind, right? So that's how I would deal with that. That's where I think Wilderson misses the boat because you get struck in post-structuralist language and you want to somehow make an ideal or an icon that has a semiotic relationship to the sign, i.e. slave, go all the way down to my psychology. I don't buy it. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So, first of all, thank you for your talk, and I really enjoyed it, but I completely agree with you. But here, the question is that, supposing, which I totally agree, that coming into the academic discipline makes you alienate from your own black group and then make you restricted into some categories, but categories to introduce yourself and to analyze yourself. What is your suggestion? So, which way you think can work for you to understand yourself as yourself and introduce yourself? Because here the nexus of power is at work, and I don't know how you want to challenge this nexus. It is so worldwide.
No, I mean, I think it's a real question. I think that the same way that we challenge that system of disciplinary power is the same that we challenge the systems of white supremacy in everyday life. You build and create a social life that does not intervene into that aspect. Again, that's why I started off with saying this is not theoretical, it's empirical. This is what happened when we failed at creating the discipline of black studies that we should have, right? When Winters talks about black studies being based in black nationalism, the black arts movement, she understood that it was a reformulation of the science that to study a different type of human being. And what we have done is we've allowed black studies through things like feminism, through things like Marxism, through these kind of left progressive Eurocentric movements to intervene and take over the language and concepts that we use to explain our own existence. The way that we resist that is that we have the courage to write ourselves into our own writings. Stop using Lacan, stop using Marx. Look at the people that actually talk about black people to talk about black people, right? And that's what I'm saying. That's the argument for black studies. There's also the argument for Latin American studies, for indigenous studies, etc. That people, and this is not a political point, this is a metaphysical point, that people who understand the ontology of what it is that they're trying to live out, i.e. if I believe that spirits are physical things, right, that these are embodiments of certain ancestors, if I fundamentally believe that, then I need a very new system besides idealism or materialism or naturalism to describe that phenomenon. So that means that I have to build up a new system of inquiring into the lived reality of that kind of social existence. And that's what we're not exploring now. Everything becomes reproductive. I'm trying to argue that we need a new conceptualization of eschatology to talk about how death is predicated on the ability of certain black people to speak. Our ability of black people to speak is predicated on certain notions of black death. I'm sorry, I said it backwards, right? People just look at me like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, you know, like, people literally are looking at me like, what? And then people just, I disagree. And, you know, and then they take them on as like, you erase black women. Like, you know, in debate, we call that a generic diss. You just throw the shit on the wall, anything sticks. Right? Right? So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, once we know the problem, so if we agree with the diagnosis of the problem, then it becomes, what types of writing are we going to do to not reproduce the problem? Right? Because we know what the concepts are, right? We know what the concept, we know what the histories are, we know what the practices are, right? I mean, if you're your PhD, come on, y'all know, if you're on your PhD program, you know that some white person has told you can't say X. Usually it's a white person. Black people say it too, but mostly usually it's a white person. Most likely a white person. You know that these things happen, right? You know, back when I was writing my dissertation, Ken and I were like, look, you know, can you really write a dissertation that's just, you know, got no white people on it unless you're criticizing them? I was like, well, yes, I can, Ken. I have read enough. I can write a whole dissertation with nothing but black people in it. And I did. The only white person I cited were people I was smashing. I was like, Shannon Sullivan's an idiot. You know, she doesn't know Du Bois, right? The reason I did that, though, is because I wanted to show the world that you can write a dissertation in philosophy that was argued about the philosophical concepts that you get from black people. That the argument about racial realism that you get in Derek Bell is an articulation of Delaney's pessimism and immigrationism. Why are you leaving? Because it's permanently racist. Why does civil rights movement not work? Because it's permanently racist. Right? Now I've read a lot more, so I go all through C.L.R. James, Eric Williams, you know, Winters, Fanon, you know, Glissant. I can go all through it now, right? But it started because I had this connection of ideas, right, between centuries apart, right? So we have ways to do this, you know, and our people have done it before, right? In a world where they would be killed for writing and reading, they still wrote and read, right? So we just have to understand, we have to make a stake in what we're trying to do, right?
But then how you want to make, because this is the way that you show yourself with the
Mhm.
authority and the vision, but then it should be recognized by your advocates, and it is not in
Oh,
the
no, you can't depend on recognition. Nah. See, white people aren't going to recognize something they know is dangerous, right? And they're not going to recognize things that they see as being sacrilegious to their discipline, right? You have to understand, right? I'm not really trying to paint a rosy picture about this. When I came out, people in philosophy said, you will never get a job in philosophy, right? They depended on it. They were like, the world is so goddamn racist that it is no way Tommy Curry is going to get a decent job, much less a Research One job. It's not going to happen, right? Because why? Because in philosophy, there was only 130, and I had pissed off most of them too, right? So it assumed that the structure of the world would take care of what they wanted, right? So that's what I'm saying. That's the danger that you engage in. If you want to do this type of work, if you're serious about it, then you have to take a leap of faith on your own work. I didn't just publish 30-some or 40 articles because I felt like doing it. I did it because I had to squash any question, right? Any question, any doubt that a white person had that this was not serious scholarship. And I went up to with 35 articles. They said I needed a book. At Texas A&M, dude, are you serious? You're like 60-something in the country. Are you serious? Right? But see, this is what I'm saying. That's the kind of confrontation. I generally have an aversion to white people, so I was okay with it. But generally speaking, that's kind of the tact that you have to have. You know, and that's what I mean when I say you're serious about this work. I mean, nobody who gets to that starts first is going to have an easy time, right? And even the people that are doing this kind of work, you know, people don't hear about Sylvia Winters. You know, I mean, it's like if you're in that genre, like, oh, she's a real radical person or she does X, but you don't hear about her. Same thing with Huey P. Newton. Nobody reads Huey. Nobody reads Huey on sexuality or gender. You know, and even Cleaver. I mean, I just found a book that Cleaver hasn't even published, right? And I'm going to try to republish it. But I know that's going to be an uphill battle because he said at the beginning of On Becoming, rape was an insurrectionary act. You know? I mean, these are the kinds of hits you have to take if you're serious about doing work. Because if you notice, and I guarantee you this, most of the people that come out and get jobs, they're reproductive, right? They reproduce the types of things that their mentors or their disciplines or the top people in they field say. And then what do you advise? Don't attack them, because you need them to like you. Don't attack them, right? Use them, get them to like, you know, and then you reproduce a whole genre. By the time you get enough power to actually attack somebody, you're like, well, damn, I'm a full professor and I'm tired, right? That's how it works. I mean, you have to step out. And like I said, I mean, I'm not encouraging you to do that if you don't have faith in your own work. But I'm saying that if you really want an answer, it could be done, right? I mean, this is what the Black student movement did when they created Black Studies, right? I mean, you know, these cats came in, these were activists, these were grassroots sociologists, these were literature professors, you know, that were making arguments for what they did, and nobody liked them, nobody tenured them, right? You know, I mean, that's the story. We have stories of black people in philosophy that have gone and served their whole lives as lecturers because they wanted to study black experience. They were doing it. And here's the I don't want to curse on camera. Here's the crazy part about it is that they were doing it on the basis of using white people. They were doing it on people like Sartre, trying to show how there's an existential phenomenology. And they still wouldn't hire these people. So this, you have to understand. You have to understand the racism and the kind of Eurocentric patriarchal nature of the academy. You know, you got to, you know, and I say it too. You got to understand the racism and cultural imperialism and gender studies, women and gender studies too, right? I mean, those concepts, the way that they fit so nicely into the academy, that's a problem. You know, so you're basically trying to be, you know, commit treason in a certain sense, be a revolutionary. It's a, you know, it's something that you got to live out. You can't just talk about. You know. Yes, sir.
So I was interested in your articulation of the thingnification of the black male insofar as it annihilates conversation about black male sexuality or relegates it to the realm of black feminist thought, which you have criticized rightly. So what resources, you mentioned a couple of them, what would you do or what resources are available for a reconstruction of black male subjectivity that avoids the pitfalls that you have identified with historically looking at black male sexuality?
Well, I mean, I think two things. Theoretically, I think Winters gives us a very good example of what that looks like. Preferring the concept of genre, meaning the kind of social existence or ontological existence rather than gender, right? I think that's an important theoretical displacement. Because for Winters, she argues that feminism is bourgeois in the sense that it categorizes the black feminist above the black woman, as if the black woman is either unconscious, living in false consciousness, or just doesn't understand her condition or history, right? And she asks, well, what happens when you do this? What happens to the black woman, the black man, and the black child, right? So genre, I think, is a different inlet to not reproducing a hierarchy of kinds, but rather a science of inquiring into the kinds of black existence that are before us, right? The second thing is, and we talked about this kind of upstairs, it's the articulation of a very specific historical understanding of what black men were trying to do. So, like I said, there are pitfalls in black manhood, right? They're human. They lived in certain times. In the 1800s, they reproduced all kind of sexist, Christian, Victorian ideas that, you know, today we think are barbaric. But women did too. Why? Because they lived in the same time period, and they were trying to prove to people they were human, right? Ida B. Wells loved her to death because she was trying to kill some white people, but she was an imperialist, right? Etta Jewel Cooper never really liked her concept of regeneration, imperialist. Christian fundamentalist, classist, hated socialism, right? Bourgeois as hell. Look down on the rank of, like, the list goes on, right? Same thing with Kermel, right? This is endemic to the black condition, trying to come up from slavery, and then, as you know, as you get from Walker in 1829, being systematically educated into ignorance. So there is a certain level of imitation and resistance that goes alongside it, but then you get to the 1900s and with Blyden, with Du Bois, with Bruce, you know, with Woodson, you get a recreation of Africa, right? You get a recreation of the connection you have to Africa. Is it absolutely true? Not all of it, right? But you have a mythology there that's trying to guide and move away from the concepts that Europe gives you just to imitate, right? It's that creative potential of culture there, right? So it's the same way that white people keep coming up with this lie that somehow these white folk that ended up in America should still read the Greeks. That have a whole lot in common with these white folk in Greece, right? It's a mythology, right? But that mythology is cannibalized, right? And what happens in that is that you justifies projects that are talking about Foucault, aesthetics of existence, with Aristotle, completely different, right? Or even saying today that we have some great shit with Dewey and all these pragmatists in America, despite the fact that these cats were racist assimilationists, but they want to be used for all kind of creative democratic experiments, right? There's a creative potentiality in human existence. And black people are human too, so they can create as well, right? And I think that that's the project of black masculinity, to recognize, to have a reflective existence, right? To recognize that it's not simply mimetic, that it doesn't seek to imitate the problems, but it's also reflected on some things. It said, oh, you know, black women, there's some things that you got to work on here too. There's some ontologies, some anthropologies here that you've bought into and made biological. They're really just contingent cultural realities, right? Like the African mother concept, right? Now we think about mothers in a capitalist Western sensibility. We don't look at it as a regenerative force of the world and the universe that most African people were talking about, and that Du Bois was talking about in Darkwater. Right? These are very important aspects. People, like I told you, Oyuwomi, Thomas, etc., have written about these. So these concepts of African matriarchy that's not fixed to gender, but performed through existence are really something that we should point out. And I think that those are the resources we can use to build into a new types of black studies. And what I find immensely interesting is that despite Black Dada Nilemus, Sylvia Winters actually sees this as being the strength of Baraka's work, right? This creative possibility, right? Because she reads Black Dada as pointing out the contradiction of sexuality. So are y'all familiar with that poem? Right. Rape the father, rape the daughter, slice the mother's throat, right? And I find this very powerful because, as usual, Susan Brown Miller is focused, well, he said rape, right? But what he says is rape the father and the daughter, right? This is that hetero homo decentering, right? And kill the mother. So he's talking about this reproductive capacity of the white race, right? It's very fascinating, but again, we blind ourselves to what, to the categories that we want to see, and I think that these are very real issues in terms of how we build up and politically challenge through creative potentiality and political creativity, certain aspects of white supremacy. But we could also be decadent, right? We could go to Cleaver Route and make the mistake of believing what we were created as is what we should live out. Right? We could also be decadent. Right? Yes, ma'am.
So how do I, or should I even, address these issues, bring them to light to my students? Because the classes I teach in women's studies and that area, the ones that I teach tend to be mostly black. So as a white woman, do I address these? Do I make them aware of this?
No.
How do I, as a white person, as a white female, bring this without coming across or without appearing to be speaking to something that I have no personal experience with?
Well, I mean, because I think at that point it becomes existential and historical, right? I mean, the way that you relate whiteness, Kenneth and I have talked about this for years, right? The way that you relate the knowledge of the role that white people have played in history, right? So be it white women raping, or be it white women in the Klan, or being even the idea that, white people have, created these kinds of asymmetrical power relations, that should be a personal story, right? That should be, right, the reflective capacity of the human mind and their own condition, right? Now, in terms of if we get into the identity politics / positive knowledge theory, then that may create some problems, right? In terms of you saying, well, look, as a white person, this is what black people absolutely should do because this is like that top-down approach. That's different, right?
Yeah,
Right. I mean, I think we all kind of know the basic problem with that. But in terms of you communicating this as historical knowledge, as actual knowledge, as part of the way that we black studies should fundamentally transform these pathologies of the European mind, I mean, you convey the information and you discuss it. Let their existence, their lived experience, their intellectual capacities fill in the blanks that you may have. Yeah. I mean, this is that's what I'm saying. Like, we are so guided by identity politics, right? Now, don't get me mistaken, right? Because there's some shit that white people just should not be doing, right? I'm very clear about that, right? But in terms of how we understand knowledge and the historical project of disseminating knowledge, that's not the aspect of it. It's the use of whiteness to construct the potentiality and existence of other people. That's the problem, right? This is what Fanon was arguing about. This is what Ida was arguing about. This is what Du Bois. This is the failure of the Niagara movement and NAACP. That's the problem. Us talking about the issues of whiteness, white supremacy, empire, etc. That's not the problem, right? Other questions? Is that like a half hand or anything else? All right. Well, thank y'all very much. I really appreciate the invite, and I hope you enjoyed the paper.